Hi, this is Paul. I was reading this book. I mentioned this book in my series on Peugeot's The Language of Creation. Get it in the picture here. And my guess is that somebody out there who watches my videos and leaves comments recommended this book because I'd never heard of it, and I had a sample copy of it in my Kindle collection. And I usually do that when someone recommends a book and there's a sample, so that way I don't have to buy it. So I buy fewer books that I don't get around to reading, and so I just have a sample. And then when I was doing my video on heaven and earth, the hierarchy of heaven and earth came up. And I thought, wow, that's an interesting title. And with an introduction by C.S. Lewis. Wow, that's an interesting book. And so then I went ahead and I bought the whole book and started looking at it. And this book is by D.E. Harding, and it was first published in 1952. Illustrations were drawn by the author, by the Trust in 2011. And then, a couple nights ago, I sat down and I read the preface. And I thought I was watching... I thought I was shocked. 1952. And this is C.S. Lewis's clearest articulation of the meaning crisis that I have read. This book is, I believe, writes Lewis, this is the preface, the first attempt to reverse a movement of thought which has been going on since the beginning of philosophy. The process whereby man has come to know the universe is one from one point of view extremely complicated, from another alarmingly simple. We can observe a single one-way progression. At the outset, the universe appears packed with will, intelligence, life, and positive qualities. Every tree is a nymph, every planet a god. Now, again, we're here with the manifest image, the scientific image. And Lewis doesn't have that language. That language will come along a little bit, probably about the same time in philosophy. But Lewis is saying, and Lewis is also obviously echoing some Barfield here in terms of, these splits, these forks in the road that Lewis notes. And so, on one hand, the universe, at the outset, the universe appears with will, intelligence, life, positive qualities. Every tree is a nymph, every planet a god. Man himself is akin to the gods. The advance of knowledge gradually empties the rich and genial universe. We're talking about, we might say, disenchantment here. The advance of knowledge gradually empties the rich and genial universe, first of its gods, then of its colors, smells, sounds, tastes, and finally of solidity itself, as solidity was originally imagined. As these items are taken from the world, they are transferred to the subjective side of the account. In other words, smells, colors, sounds, tastes, this manifest image goes to the subjective side of the count. So here we have a division between subjective and objective. Classified as our sensations, thoughts, images, or emotions. The subject becomes gorged, inflated at the expense of the object. But the matter does not rest there. The same method which has emptied the world now proceeds to empty ourselves. And when I read that, I thought of how many videos where I talked about the fact that, what is the meaning crisis? Well, first we learn that the world is stranger than we imagine, and then we learn that we are systemic like the world is, and so that pervasive, consuming strangeness, mechanistic attempts to empty the world of the manifest image continues on into us. Let me get rid of this little annoying thing here. There we go. The masters of the method soon announced, that of course is science, the masters of the method soon announced that we were just as mistaken, and mistaken in much the same way when we attributed souls or selves or minds to human organisms, as when we attributed dryads to the trees. Animism apparently begins at home. And if you take a listen to, maybe I'll play it in this video actually, if you listen to Vervaeke's conversation with Sam that I played in the Jordan Peterson commentary, Vervaeke goes into that because John Vervaeke notices that if you read psychology, the self is all over the place, but when asked, well, what are we talking about? Whoosh. Well, we don't really know what we're talking about. Persons. Well, we all know persons, and we're terribly upset that persons' rights are being violated and personhood is being destroyed, and both the right and the left of our political polarity. But then you ask, well, what is a person? Whoosh. It goes away. You bridges of memeing people. I'll give one more for you. Are you ready? Poosh. You can make a meme of that if you want to. Animism apparently begins at home. We who have personified all other things turn out to be ourselves mere personifications. Man is indeed akin to the gods, that is, he is no less phantasmal than they. Just as the dryad is a ghost, an abbreviated symbol for all the facts we know about the tree foolishly mistaken for a mysterious entity above, over and above the facts, so the man's mind or consciousness is an abbreviated symbol for certain verifiable facts about his behavior. A symbol mistaken for a thing. And just as we have been broken of our bad habit of personifying trees, so we must be now broken of our bad habit of personifying men. A reform already effected in the political field. Remember, he's writing this in 1952. There never was a subjective account into which we could transfer the items which the objective had lost. There is no consciousness to contain, as images or private experiences, all the lost gods, colors, and concepts. Consciousness is not the sort of noun that can be used in that way. For we are given to understand that our mistake was a linguistic one. Our previous theologies, metaphysics, and psychologies were a byproduct of our bad grammar. So if we correct the language, well, then we can fix the world, right? Max Muller's formula, mythology is a disease of language, thus returns with a wider scope than we had ever dreamed of. We were not even imagining these things. We were only talking confusedly. All the questions which humanity has hitherto asked with deep concern for the answer turn out to be unanswerable. Not because the answers are hidden from us, like goddess Privité, but because they are nonsense questions like, how far is it from London Bridge to Christmas Day? What we thought we were loving when we loved a woman or a friend was not even a phantom, like a phantom sail which starving sailors think they see on the horizon. It was something more like a pun. And then he adds some Latin that I can't say. It is as though a man deceived by the linguistic similarity between myself and my spectacles should start looking around for his self to put in his pocket before he left his bedroom in the morning. He might want it during the course of a day. If we lament the discovery that our friends have no selves in the old sense, we shall behave like a man who shed bitter tears at being unable to find his self anywhere on the dressing table or even underneath it. And thus we arrive at the result uncommonly like zero. While we were reducing the world to almost nothing, we deceived ourselves with the fancy that all of its lost qualities were being kept safe, if in a somewhat humbled condition, as the things in our own mind. Apparently, we had no mind of the sort required. The subject is as empty as the object. Almost nobody has been making linguistic mistakes about almost nothing. By and large, this is the only thing that has ever happened. Now, the trouble about this conclusion is not simply that it is unwelcome to our emotions. It is not unwelcome to them at all times or in all people. This philosophy, like every other, has its pleasures, and it will, I fancy, prove very congenial to government. Lewis always. The old liberty talk was very mixed up with the idea that, as inside the ruler, so inside the subject, there was a whole world, to him the center of all worlds, capacious of endless suffering and delight. But now, of course, he has no inside except the sort you can find by cutting him open. If I had to burn a man alive, I think I should find his doctrine uncomfortable. The real difficulty for most of us is more like a physical difficulty. We find it impossible to keep our minds, even for 10 seconds in a stretch, twisted into the shape that this philosophy demands. And to do him justice, Hume, who is its great ancestor, warned us not to try. He recommended backgammon instead, and freely admitted when, after a suitable dose, we return to our theory, we should find it cold and strained and ridiculous. And obviously, if we really must accept nihilism, that is how we shall have to live. Just as, if we had diabetes, we must take insulin. If one would rather not have diabetes and do without the insulin, if there should, after all, turn out to be any alternative to philosophy that can be supported only by repeated and presumably increasing doses of backgammon, I suppose that most people would be glad to hear of it. There is indeed, or so I am told, one way of living under this philosophy without the backgammon, but it is not one a man would like to try. I have heard that there are states of insanity in which such a nihilistic doctrine becomes readily credible. That is, as Dr. I.A. Richards would say, belief feelings are attached to it. The patient has an experience of being nobody in a world of nobodies and nothings. Those who return from this condition describe it as highly disagreeable. Now, there is, of course, nothing new in the attempt to process that. Now, there is nothing new in the attempt to arrest the process that has led us from the living universe, where man meets the gods, to the final void, where almost nobody discovers his mistakes about almost nothing. Every step in that process has been contested. Many rearguard actions have been fought, some of them fought at the moment. But it has only been a question of arresting, not of reversing the moment. That is what makes Mr. Harding's book so important. If it works, then we shall have seen the beginning of a reversal. Not a stand here or a stand there, but a kind of thought which attempts to reopen the whole question. And we feel sure in advance that the only thought of this type can help. The fatal slip which has led us to nihilism must have occurred at the very beginning. There is, of course, no question of returning to animism, as animism was before the rot began. No one supposed that the belief of pre-philosophic humanity, just as they stood before they were criticized, can or should be restored. The question is whether the first thinkers, in modifying, and rightly modifying, them under criticism, did not make some rash and unnecessary concession. It was certainly not their intention to commit us to the absurd consequences that have actually followed. The sort of error is, of course, very common in debate, or even in our solitary thought. We start with a view which contains a good deal of truth, though in a confused or exaggerated form. Objections are then suggested, and we withdraw it. But hours later, we discover that we have emptied the baby out with the bath, and that the original view must have contained certain truths for lack of which they are now entangled in absurdities. So here, in emptying out the dryads and the gods, which admittedly would not do just as they stood, we appear to have thrown out the whole universe, ourselves included. We must go back and begin over again. this time with a better chance of success. For, of course, we can now use all particular truths and all improvements of method which our argument may have thrown up as byproducts in its otherwise ruinous course. It would be affectation to pretend that I know whether Mr. Harding's attempt in its present form will work. Very possibly not. And given the fact that the book seems to be obscure, at least it was lost to me, and has never come up in any of our discussions, it appears to be a failure. I've only read a chapter or two of the book. It's a very interesting book, but I'm not quite sure what to make of it. Not wholly unlike the fact that when I was first introduced to the work of the Peugeot brothers, I wasn't quite sure what to make of that work either. We are all sort of trapped in the worlds that we have inherited and the projections that we can foist upon them. One expects the first or the 21st rocket to the moon will make a good landing. Now this, of course, was almost 20 years before the moon landing. But it is a beginning. If it should turn out to have been even the remote ancestor of some system which will give us again a credible universe inhabited by credible agents and observers, this will still have been a very important book indeed. It has also given me that bracing and satisfying experience which, in certain books of theory, seem to be partially independent of our final agreement or disagreement. It is an experience most eagerly disengaged by remembering what has happened to us whenever we turned from the inferior exponent of a system, even a system we reject, to its great doctors. I have had it in turning from common existentialist to Monsieur Sartre himself, from the Calvinists to the Institutio, from the Transcendentalists to Emerson, from books about Renaissance Platonism to Ficino. One may still disagree. I disagree heartily with all the authors I have just named. But one now sees, for the first time, why anyone did agree. One has breathed a new air, become free of a new country. It may be a country you cannot live in, but you now know why the natives love it. You will henceforth see all the systems a little differently because you have been inside that one. And if you go back to my question and answer 2 weeks ago, we talked about the inside view with the outside view, which is, of course, Lewis, the reflections from the tool shed, looking at the light or looking through the light. You'll henceforth see all the systems a little differently because you have been inside that one. From this point of view, philosophies have some of the same qualities as works of art. I'm not referring at all to the literary art with which they may or may not be expressed. It is I should have learned Latin. It is the ipsetas, the peculiar unity of effect produced by a special balancing and patterning of thoughts and classes of thought. A delight very much like which was given by Hesse's The Glass Bead Game, which if you go back to my earlier conversations with Ron Dart, we talked about. And Ron Dart was very excited about it, and I didn't know anything about it. And I still don't know much about it. But here's Lewis bringing it up and kind of points me to, okay, well, maybe I'm going to have to read The Glass Bead Game, which is all about the academy and philosophies and such, in the book of that name, which Lewis gives us in German, if it could really exist. I owe a new experience of that kind to Mr. Harding. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the video here, and I'm going to just post this as a video as such, because I think this is a really interesting point of seeing how Lewis saw the meaning crisis very clearly in 1952 and wrote about it in a very interesting way in a book I had never heard of. And so I want people to find it. So I'm going to make a little video of just this, and then I'm going to keep talking about it. And I'm going to post that video tomorrow, and you can find that tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. on the channel. And we'll have question and answer at 10 a.m., or I'll post it at 6 a.m. on the channel, and we'll have question and answer at 10 a.m. As we usually do on Fridays.